It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. So two of the questions that Harvard and New Yorker magazine historian Jill Lepore asks in her new book are these. Why and when did the unthinkable become thinkable? That's a big question. And how did a nightmare become a dream? The nightmare she's talking about is a world governed by machines, algorithms, and the handful of people, really men, if you look at the history of this, who own them. Lepore calls this the artificial state. In her telling, it's been decades in the making, built out of Cold War computing, science fiction, and a philosophy that treats the whole universe as a machine you can calculate your way through. Jill Lepore, as many of you may know, is a professor of American history at Harvard, a staff writer at The New Yorker, and author of a number of books, including the bestseller These Truths. Her new one is called The Rise and Fall of the Artificial State. And would you believe with a title like that this is a hopeful book? Jill Lepore, welcome back to WNYC. Always great to have you.
Thanks so much, Brian.
And listeners will open up the phones right away on this theme or anything you always wanted to ask Jill Lepore but didn't have her over for dinner. 212-433-WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. So what is the artificial state as you define it in this book?
The artificial state is both something that is being built and also a fantasy. So it's something that is not yet built, but I wanted to give a name to the state we're increasingly finding ourselves in, which in some ways is the successor to the liberal democratic nation state, right? Which is itself a new thing under the sun, really only emerged at the end of the 18th century. But increasingly the elements of what constitutes a nation state have been taken over by corporations and have become increasingly automated. I think the easiest place to see that is in the so-called public sphere, right, where citizens are supposed to be deliberating democratically, getting information, arguing with one another, communicating with their representatives. Representatives are supposed to be communicating with their constituents. That public sphere, of course, is now privately owned and is mostly consists of social media platforms. There are rare exceptions like public media, which we have the privilege to be on today. But it's important to note that in addition to being ruled by algorithms and run on machines owned by corporations who have their own private interests, the public sphere is now populated more by bots than by humans. There are more robots online in any platform than there are humans.
Does that make, or that group of things you just described, make society or democracy lean in particular directions?
I don't think it has to necessarily lean in a particular direction. We could think of, I think, cases immediately where there was a point in time when Twitter was significantly left-leaning, and X, its replacement, is significantly right-leaning. It's not endemic to the technology, right? Technologies themselves don't have politics.
Mm-hmm. Right. But that raises the question as to whether it's good or bad or neutral in terms of its effect on people.
I think what the point is that people don't have much control over these technologies, especially technologies of communication, that have billed themselves as democratizing and in fact have largely been the reverse. I mean, like a good way to think about, say, Twitter is like in its sort of short history. Twitter was founded, I think, 2006, 2007, and really just mainly kind of just as a lark. Like it would be a goofy thing to do to say, you know, I had a tuna fish sandwich today for lunch. What did you have? Like just like fun status updates kinds of things. But by 2012, Twitter had decided to bill itself as a replacement for the public sphere, a town hall. It turned out that politicians really liked using Twitter. They liked communicating that way. They liked using Twitter as a kind of a way to get a pulse of the feeling of the nation or the feeling of their constituents. And so Twitter decided to market itself that way. And at the time, though, fewer than, I think, 1 in 5 Americans even had a Twitter account. Almost all of the tweeting about politics, more than 90% of all political tweeting, was done by less than 10% of political tweeters. So, and most people who are on Twitter weren't tweeting about politics, right? So now you have a minority of Americans are using this platform. A minority of that minority are using it to talk about politics. And a minority of that minority are doing 90% of all the tweeting about politics. And meanwhile, Twitter is boasting that you could use Twitter to get a sense of what the as a proxy for the electorate. And elected officials would say, well, I don't know, I'm going to decide how I might vote on this, how I might think about this. I'm going to see what's going on Twitter. It could not have been a less representative form. And in fact, was a radicalizing form, because that very tiny minority of a minority of a minority of people who were posting about politics on Twitter were politically radical. They were at the extremes of the left and the right. And so Twitter became a kind of radicalizing engine. There wasn't a malign intention behind that. But when we think about the polarization of our politics, which of course began decades before social media, it was really accelerated by social media. And now those look like the good old days compared to today, when the majority of posts on X are made by bots.
You're right. The artificial state rests on two ideas. The first is mechanical philosophy, the idea that everything, the natural world, the entire universe, is a machine that operates according to deducible laws, rules subject to quantification, calculation, and prediction. The second is technological determinism, the idea that machines determine the course of history and represent a march of progress. I think you were just talking about the second one. Maybe talk about the first one, this idea of mechanical philosophy.
So we very much live in a world that has benefited from the intellectual revolution that we associate with mechanical philosophy, which is the scientific revolution of the 17th century and then the Enlightenment. Like when you think about the Copernican revolution or Newtonian physics, right? Sort of understanding that, coming to the realization that the natural world operates by deducible laws, like gravity. In the 18th century, that idea was first applied to politics, and the result was our Constitution, right? In 1787, the drafters of the Constitution, like Alexander Hamilton, talked about the Constitution as the application of the wisdom of antiquity and the ancients, and essentially, especially the Romans, married to the science of the Enlightenment. The idea that you could deduce through reason a set of laws by which politics operated. Hamilton called this the science of politics. And the framers of the U.S. Constitution saw themselves as essentially building a machine. They talked about the Constitution as a machine that would need to be tinkered with by future generations and adjusted over the course of time. But they had a kind of hope that, when we talk about the checks and balances of the Constitution or the separation of powers, these are actually mechanical ideas. Like, they were thinking about this as a machine, like a clock whose clock works. The gears had to be perfectly balanced. So I think that idea is very much a way that we even think about our government. That's different than automating it, though. That's building a machine that humans would operate and humans would use. That's different than the automation of politics.
So you're not, because it could have sounded from the beginning of that answer like you were critiquing the Enlightenment idea of organizing society based on reason. But that's not what you're doing, right?
No.
It's more the reliance on machines that some of that seemed to lead to.
Yeah, I mean, I like, mechanical philosophy has its critics, and there are limits to it, and it was a kind of fetish of a moment in a way, but it also has a great deal to offer, right? Most of how we think about the natural world is derived from that philosophy. And
you're right that reading science fiction is crucial both to understanding the rise of the artificial state and to anticipating its fall. We didn't get to the fall of the artificial state part of the title of your book, but where does science fiction start to come in, because it is, after all, fiction? So you get the idea emerging by the end of the 18th century, but certainly across the 19th century,
with the incredible mechanical revolution of the industrial era, machine after machine after machine, replacing human labor and animal labor in particular, with the telegraph, the railroad, the power loom. And writers began to imagine what the future might look like as machines continued to get faster and stronger and more powerful. And there were already experiments with devising talking machines and calculating machines, machines that could be used to count. Or like the punch card is invented in the first half of the 19th century. So early science fiction writers, we don't really call it science fiction until the 20th century, but early science fiction writers began imagining a future in which machines would become so powerful and begin to be able to think and to talk. And if that happened, eventually they would out-evolve humans, right? So you get this idea after Darwin's theory of evolution, after he introduced that idea in 1859 with On the Origin of Species, right? So if machines are always progressing, they're getting faster, they're getting more powerful, and then increasingly they seem to be getting smarter, right? And then there's also this sort of idea of evolution that you could attach to that. Well, the speed of human evolution is going to be nothing compared to the speed of technological progress with machines. So people began imagining a possible future in which machines rule over humankind. And I think of this as the parable of the artificial state. It's really an evergreen in science fiction. Like people can immediately think of, the Terminator, like we all have seen a lot of these movies. Mm-hmm. They're retellings of very old stories, but you already have that story in science fiction by the 1860s.
And so you must be very interested in some of these recent stories in the news this summer, which, came out after your book was written, about AI tools that kind of escaped what their humans thought they were telling them to do or the confines they were supposed to stay in.
Yeah, and people, I think it's inevitable that people read those news stories and put them into the plot of the Terminator. The very first Terminator movie kind of starts with a flashback about the Cybernetics Corporation that had built these machines, and they had these rules for them, and they were contained in certain ways, but they always kind of escape the container. They figure out how to break the rules. It is a very overdetermined plot in science fiction, but we seem to be living it now.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, my guest is the Harvard and New Yorker magazine historian, Jill Lepore, whose new book is The Rise and Fall of the Artificial State. 212-433 WNYC. If you have a question or comment, 212-433-9692. You write, by the middle of the 2020s, vastly consequential decisions about the future of Earth and everyone and everything on it were being made by a handful of men based on their colossal accumulation of wealth, their catastrophic misreading of history, literature, and philosophy, and their breathtaking contempt for ordinary people, living and dead, unquote. So in what way do you think these men misread history, literature, and philosophy?
I think they're fundamentally uninterested in history, literature, and philosophy. Honestly, there's a real commitment in the culture of Silicon Valley that goes back decades, really, which is to abjure the humanities. One thing you're really not supposed to do is look to the past. There are not lessons to be found in the past. There is not wisdom among the ancients. There is not knowledge to be discovered in excavating the past. What one should be doing is always looking forward to the future and disruptively innovating. This is a kind of real deep-seated commitment. Even if you think about the dismissal of reading, right? Reading, the idea with these new tools is that reading can be done for you. You can just get a chatbot to summarize what you might need to read for class, right? There's a lot of dismissal of the idea that knowledge can be found in these places, in spite of a lot of there's a kind of fetish for philosophy, right? There's a lot of like the rationalist movement, or I think a lot of these people think of themselves as philosopher kings, or not. I mean, there are not many of them, but some of these people kind of like Peter Thiel, I think, fashions himself as a kind of philosopher. So does Alex Karp from Palantir.
And maybe Musk?
I think Musk certainly thinks of himself as something of a king. I'm not sure about the philosopher part of philosopher king. But I do think they have been granted by the mass media, really starting in the 1990s. I think people forget about how closely the culture of kind of lifestyles of the rich and famous of the 1990s that also brought a younger Donald Trump to a national stage was about building plinths and putting Silicon Valley entrepreneurs on top of those plinths. Like when Mark Andreessen was on the cover of Time magazine and a golden throne, there was a lot of real sort of worship of these young men of progress, these young Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. And it married the culture of celebrity to a fascination with wealth. I mean, could just remember JR in Dallas, there was just a kind of fetish of the ultra wealthy in the 90s that attached to a long-standing and of course entirely understandable admiration for engineering ingenuity, like going back to Edison. But there was just a kind of propping up of these people, like we should be waiting with bated breath for their next manifesto. That really started in the 90s with a lot of these internet manifestos, right? In 1996, the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. That there would be these decrees offered up from on high by Silicon Valley, and none of the rest of us, were allowed to. We couldn't possibly understand what they understood about the future that was coming, and we therefore ought to be always listening to them. And a lot of these people were very young men who'd kind of grown up with pulpy science fiction, and that was their philosophy, and they didn't have a vantage on history, and they weren't interested in the past, and they weren't especially good readers of science fiction, among other things. They were tremendous engineers, really adventurous businessmen. But why we should be taking our political arrangements from them is a thornier question.
In the passage from your book that I just read, you did write, vastly consequential decisions about the future of everything were being made by a handful of men based on their colossal accumulation of wealth. Is there a gendered aspect to this, or is it the fact that the ones you're citing here and the ones that we tend to think of in relationship to this are men, a coincidence?
I don't think it's wholly coincident. It's not, a significant portion of my reading, but I mean, I think it's almost dispositional, and I don't know that this has any particular attachment to gender, but there's a certain sort of person who is delighted with the prospect of walking into a hotel and having a robot check you into your room. And then there's another sort of person that would just really rather talk to a human being. Like you've got your bawling baby with you and your snotty toddler, and it's been a really long day, and you have some questions, and you'd like to talk to someone who's kind of going to understand your situation. And if you've been put in a basement room with no light, you want to be able to have a fellow human being to say, I wonder if I could change I don't know, whatever, this is a goofy example, but I'm just trying to give something that's very ordinary. But, there is a person to be well, I just would much rather talk to a machine. I mean, there are people who would rather get an agentic AI to do their shopping for them online than go into a shop and bring a friend and say, well, how do these pants look? I don't know. I wouldn't say that's necessarily gendered. I mean, maybe at the margins it's gendered, but I think most people have a mix of that, right? It would be kind of convenient to have my agentic AI buy my new pair of pants. But on the other hand, I haven't seen a friend in 2 weeks. I could go shopping. I could go shopping with a friend. I just think we haven't really taken stock of the price we pay socially and politically for the daily replacement of human interaction with the convenience of the use of machinery. And I think there's a lot of concern about those social effects, right? You think of the increasing call for bans on social media for children, or kids can't have their iPhones with them in school, or we are now engaged in work that is trying to kind of undo some of the social damage of that kind of alienation. I don't that's not what my book is about. My book really is about the political consequences. What does it mean for democracy when you don't go down to the town hall or go to your union hall to have a face-to-face meeting, when you just do things online that are fulfilling your obligations as a citizen to participation, representation, and deliberation? What is the effect on civil society and democratic governance?
Maybe somewhat to that point, listener writes, people like Curtis Yarvin have deep ties to white nationalism on top of their contempt for ordinary people. They confuse wealth with intelligence. Any comment on that one?
Yeah, I write about Yarvin very briefly. He's a neo-monarchist, and I think, remains a pretty fringe figure, so I take the listener's
point. But I think you reference him in the book as someone who's influenced Peter Thiel's thinking. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's worth noting that it's not like I'm imagining that these people don't believe in the liberal democratic nation state, because they've said it themselves. Certainly Yarvin does not, but neither does Thiel. I mean, he just doesn't really believe in democracy anymore. And this has happened before, right? There have been other moments in history when people have thought democracy is just not up to dealing with the challenges that rapid technological change offers us. A lot of the political manifestos that are written by these, like someone like a Mark Zuckerberg or a Mark Andreessen or a Peter Thiel or an Elon Musk, they actually are recyclings of manifestos that were written in the 1930s by fascists and by technocrats in the United States and Canada, people who are part of a movement known as Technocracy Incorporated, who believed that democracy was under pressure all over the world, given the crises, economic crises, financial crisis of the 1930s. And of course, democracies collapsed all over the world, where people, where fascism rose in its place, communism rose in its place. And in the U.S., there was this, in Canada, there was a very strong challenger to democracy known as technocracy. And the manifestos, if you go back and read them, of the technocracy movement of the 1930s really are just kind of early drafts of the manifestos that come out of Silicon Valley today.
And, there's this Peter Thiel quote I've read where he actually says, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." And I don't know the full context for that, but do you think that's just him, or is that a rising strain of thought among people who have these relationships to our mechanized world?
I don't think that's just him. And I also think, this handful of CEOs, I call them in the book the architects of the artificial state, they believe that the tools that they have in their hands, that they control, that their companies are developing, are more powerful than any other tool that humans have ever held in their hands, and that the control of them lies far above the limited sovereignty of nation states. So when these guys talk about the future of humanity, the future of civilization, the future of the planet, that's because they believe that their power is above that of the nation state, that their power, that they're over these tools, relates to all of humanity, relates to all of human civilization, relates to the future. They do in fact mean that.
Here's a real history wonk question for you as a historian. You might even need to translate the question for the rest of the listeners. But the listener writes, can you ask Professor Lepore about the difference between the mechanical philosophy of the early modern period and the organic thinking that took hold in the 19th century, a style of thinking that had a big impact on ideologies of race, with a question mark? And then the person asks, is the artificial state she sees in our future a return to mechanical thinking after an epoch of organicism? So first translate and then tell us if you think it's a relevant question.
I'm honestly not quite sure what the questioner means by organicism. I mean, I think there are a lot of competing ideas in the 19th century that are continuations of and challenges to mechanical philosophy. One would be transcendentalism, another would be romanticism. Maybe she's thinking about evolutionary biology and its prominence by the latter half of the 19th century. and the rise of eugenics. I'm not quite
Right.
sure what the question is really about.
I just
I'm
assumed if
sorry
I
to
did,
disappoint. Yeah.
I just assumed if I didn't understand the question, the person was smarter than me. Maybe it was just obtuse. Jean in Manhattan, you're on WNYC with Jill Lepore. Hello.
Oh, this is an honor. I just have a question because I'm nervous to Professor Lepore. Does this all reflect the rise of machines, the mechanical thinking? Does all of this reflect human laziness? Because if we're not interacting on a political level, within politics, does this all reflect human laziness? And then what will what do you see will happen with education if we're getting a kind of lazy feeling about it? That's it. Love you. Bye.
Thanks so much. I mean, I think the Industrial Revolution was chiefly about using machines to replace animal and human labor, right? Like, you're not going to be using horses to ride across a field. You're going to be using a railroad, or you're going to be using some kind of other powered vehicle. Is that about labor? I think people would have said that was about emancipating humans from drudgery and actually emancipating animals from a certain kind of drudgery. That was a much slower task. I think people who did that very heavy labor were, many of them, hugely relieved to be freed of it and have other kinds of work that they could do. That goes many different ways. Obviously, the Luddites and other opponents of the Industrial Revolution had different ideas about whether it was emancipatory to be relieved of physical labor in many ways. That's not the revolution that we're in now. I guess with the coming humanoid robots, that is actually about replacing the labor of, like, you don't have to bother to clean your house. You can have a robot do it. You don't have to visit your grandmother in a nursing home. A robot is taking care of her. But the chatbots, that revolution is about human thought. And I guess it's also about human engagement with other humans socially and politically, which can also be said of the humanoid robots, especially the coming of the caretaking robots. This is sort of, I think, the next big challenge socially. Is it the right thing to use a robot babysitter kind of thing? I think these tools are adopted when there is a choice to adopt them because they are convenient. They're fast. They're efficient. They give the appearance of being cheap. I think their costs are tremendous, but a lot of their costs are not immediately obvious to people. And is that laziness? I don't know that I would use the term. Mm-hmm. Maybe it is. I mean, I guess, like, an example I often give is, like, okay, I'm trying to figure out what to put in my garden, now that my beans are done and I have an open spot and I don't want it to go to weeds. Like, I could ask Claude, or I could walk over to my neighbor's house because my neighbor's a great gardener and say, what should I do? And maybe that's just laziness. Like, actually, it may be that Claude would give me a better answer, like a fuller, richer, more useful answer than my neighbor. But what I haven't calculated is that it does cost something to ask a chatbot, right? That's what the data center backlash is about. It's costing a tremendous amount of energy. It's using up natural resources to be putting these petty queries to chatbots. And also, I've worsened my relationship with my neighbor by not bothering to go say hello and ask this question. Like, my relationship with my neighbor becomes thinner. I became more alienated from my neighborhood and my community by not doing that. So maybe the listener has a point. Maybe it is a kind of laziness. I think it takes a determined effort to say no to the kinds of conveniences, though, that are offered by these tools.
Yeah. We have a few more minutes with Harvard and New York Magazine historian Jill Lepore on her new book, The Rise and Fall of the Artificial State. We've really been talking about the rise of it the whole time so far. So after this very short break, we're going to talk about why she includes the fall of the artificial state in this book. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. A few more minutes with Jill Lepore and her book, The Rise and Fall of the Artificial State. So I think so far we've been talking about how the artificial state is becoming all-consuming. Personal choices, democracy, other things. Why the fall?
The fall is predicted in every piece of science fiction that engages in what I call the parable of the artificial state. And the artificial state always collapses because the machinery that is its infrastructure requires energy from sources in the natural world. And the natural world's resources are finite. So eventually the machine stops. And the question, so the artificial state will always fail. What differentiates one kind of story from another is whether humans manage to survive that fall. And I think actually it's sort of interesting to me that last summer when I was working on this book and writing about the kind of always narratively predicted fall of the artificial state, it didn't really seem that likely to me. It all feels, I think, to most of us, we feel powerless in the face of these set of coming changes, and they also feel inevitable. I don't think they're inevitable, but it's kind of an act of faith to imagine that they're not. Whereas this summer feels different because of the data center backlash, which really is about the finite resources of the natural world. People are like, well, my electricity bills are going up, and now the landscape in my community has got this hideous blight on it. I thought we were going to be building housing for humans, not housing for machinery. Like people's reaction to the fairly underhanded building of data centers around the country has been a really large reaction, not just in the United States, but in many other parts of the world as well.
You know, I read an article on the conservative website National Review, magazine National Review site, where the headline basically asked, what if humans had had the same backlash to factories as we're now having to data centers? The implication being, you know, we wouldn't have had a lot of progress and a lot of jobs that we wound up having. As a historian, and I don't expect that you necessarily read the article, but how does the question in that headline strike you?
I mean, I think that data center backlash is potentially quite dangerous. I think it's important and it's revealing. And what people are asking for is not like, let's not ever build these, but let's actually have some democratic deliberation about building them. I mean, even the AOC and Bernie Sanders call for a national moratorium is a temporary moratorium. It's like not let's not build these. It's let's actually figure out what is the right way to build them. How many do we need? And I don't think that I don't think the analogy is particularly helpful. In that the individual use of the tools that are driving the data centers is what is being marketed to us. And I think that's different than how factories affected communities. I mean, I haven't given the analogy enough thought to really give you an especially informed answer. I don't think it's without merit. And I do think there's a certain kind of danger to, and sometimes people call this AI populism or the coming clanker revolution. Like I think there's a lot of potential political violence around data centers that I would be concerned about.
And you're right, a public debate about new tools and old tools, too, can still happen. This isn't only about artificial intelligence or data centers. It's about the hijacking of the public interest and the abandonment of the consent of the governed, unquote from your book. So who's actually in a position to force that debate? Anyone?
I think elected officials, certainly in the United States, I think Congress has a lot of responsibility for the ways in which it really has failed from the earliest days of the opening of the internet through the social media revolution, down to the AI revolution, and looking ahead to the kind of humanoid robot revolution to enact any kind of quality of life safeguards for humans. I think the libertarianism that was behind the opening of the internet extended across each of those technological changes, and Congress sat back while tech CEOs said, this will democratize life and make life better for everyone, the internet. This will democratize life and make life better for everyone, social media. This will democratize life and make life better for everyone, artificial intelligence. And Congress just kind of nodded along. We don't actually understand what you people are doing. We're not going to be bothered to educate ourselves about these technologies. We're, just whatever. Go ahead. We don't want to stifle anything. And I think it's time for Congress to think hard and to do the work.
So last question. You teach at Harvard, you write for The New Yorker, you turn out thoroughly researched, extraordinarily well-written books like this one. Listener writes, what I want to know is, when does Jill Lepore sleep?
I sleep a lot. I am a big sleeper, I'm sorry to say. I sleep a lot, and then I caffeinate a great deal.
And there we have to leave it for today with Jill Lepore, professor of American history at Harvard University, staff writer at The New Yorker, and the author of books, including now The Rise and Fall of the Artificial State. Thank you so much for sharing your research and your wisdom with us.
Thanks so much.
And that is the Brian Lehrer Show for today, produced by Lisa Allison, Mary Croak, Amina Cerna, Carl Boisrond, and Esperanza Rosenbaum, with help today from Sasha Linden Cohen, Juliana Fonda, and Milton Ruiz at the audio controls. Megan Ryan is the head of live radio. I'm Brian Lehrer. Stay tuned for all of it. And then tune in again tomorrow morning when our guests will include New Jersey Senator Andy Kim. We do a monthly Call Your Senator segment with Senator Kim, so New Jerseyans and others will be welcome to call Senator Kim. I know he wants to talk about the Iran war, among other things. So Senator Kim and more on tomorrow's Brian Lehrer Show. Meanwhile, sign up for our newsletter if you're interested at wnyc.org/BL newsletter, and stay tuned for all of it.